Day 77 of this bitch. Really? Yeah. 26 Philadelphia, 5786, Sunday, March 15th. You know, something. Uh, this is day 77. It's some shit like that. Dude, I did this fucking app update and it sucks. But like, yeah, I wish I could just make it normal. Alright, day 70, 79. Whatever. Um, we're gonna make this bit short. Tomorrow we've got to go through the fucking calendar and videos and not teaching. I'm tired. I've watched this guy before. Whatever, we'll watch his asshole. There's something that Jews like aren't known for. Like we love gefilte fish and we love cha, but something that Jews love is fucking macaroni and cheese. Really? Yeah. Why? Huh? It's good. But I was rabbinical college. My Rebbitzins granola. They used to sometimes do these fancy paste retreats. Sometimes in like Hawaii. You know, during Pesach, you can't have chametz. Like after Pesach ends, you can have chametz again and macaroni and cheese, and they would say that there'd be like steaks and like all kinds of fancy food. And all the Jews who were at this retreat would just pass all the fancy food to go right to the fucking macaroni and cheese and just take it down. Really? Yeah, I think it's hilarious. You like macaroni and cheese? Oh yeah, it's one of my faves. Really? Yeah, what's this asshole talking about? God is not static. No one knows for sure. Elevate Elu. The Zohar is a vast Elohim Chaim, but this is the Mazor of Kabbalah itself. Kabbalah crystallized in pictures, but the mystical stream within Judaism is certainly much older. For example, I just mentioned Ein Sof, God as infinity. This is certainly one of the key insights of Kabbalah, the boundlessness of God and his indefinability. The idea of Ein Sof is dependent on Maimonides' conception of God. But there's an ancient answer right in the book of Exodus when Moses learns God's secret name. Ehiyeh Asher Ehiyeh. I am who I am. I will be who I will be. Which is if right there in the book of Exodus, God is refusing to define himself. And in a sense, that lays the groundwork for the later notion, Kabbalah, of Ein Sof, the infinite. Of the various visions of God in the Bible, the most graphic is undoubtedly the opening chapter of Ezekiel. The prophet sees a throne, world heaven, accompanied by four winged creatures darting to and fro. On the throne is a figure with the appearance of a human being, surrounded by radiance, like a rainbow. Ezekiel experienced that vision near the beginning of the century, even before his book was canonized in the Bible. This vision archetype of Jewish mystical ascent. Until the emergence of Kabbalah in the Middle Ages, Jewish spiritual seekers used Ezekiel's account as their model. It came to be called Maaseh Merkabah, the account of the chariot, God's chariot throne. And that account was studied, expounded, and re-experienced. An entire literature developed, recounting the exploits of those who followed in Ezekiel's footsteps. among them some of the leading figures of Rabbinic Judaism, such as Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yishmael. The mystical journey was arduous and dangerous, requiring intense ascetic preparation, precise knowledge of secret passwords in order to be admitted to the variances which were guarded by menacing angels. Prerequisites were knowledge of Torah, observance of the mitzvot, and ethical purity. The final goal was to attain a vision of that divine throne. This account over the following centuries developed further, and individuals and small groups pondered those secrets of Ezekiel and developed techniques of meditation, refining their conception of God. As Jews migrated from the Middle East to Europe, these speculations spread to the West. Certain teachings were referred to as Kabbalah, literally that which has been received. The root kabel means to receive, so you could translate Kabbalah, receiving, or that which has been received, or tradition, but it was applied specifically to these mystical teachings based on the vision Ezekiel had of the throne. To the entire body of mystical tradition, vibrant Jewish community whose culture encompassed rabbinic law, philosophy, as well as mysticism. From Provence, these teachings spread southward, spilling over the Pyrenees into Spain, and it's here in 13th century Spain that Kabbalah crystallizes. Its masterpiece was Sefer HaZohar. What is the Zohar? And let me just make this distinction. There's no book called the Kabbalah. Kabbalah is really a name for the overall philosophy, the whole movement of Jewish mysticism. The Zohar is the major text of the Kabbalah. First, the title of Zohar means radiance. The Hamaskilim Yazhiru Kazohar Harakia. Enlightened will shine like the Zohar, the radiance of the sky. The Zohar seemed to appear out of nowhere. Around the year 1280, a Spanish Kabbalist named Moses de Leon began circulating booklets of biblical commentary. These are the first installments of the Zohar, sparkling with invented words, arcane symbolism, and erotic imagery. The tales and teachings were puzzling, yet enchanting. Moses de Leon claimed that he was merely the scribe, copying from an ancient manuscript. The original had supposedly been composed over 1100 years earlier in the circle of Shimon Bar Yochai, the famous disciple of Rabbi Akiva, who lived in the 2nd century in the land of Israel. This Rabbi had hid from the Roman authorities in a cave, and the Kabbalists imagined that Kabbalah and the Zohar was conceived. The text had made its way, supposedly, from Galilee to Spain, and now Moses de Leon was making copies of them. So this is the most astounding thing about the Zohar. The book never appeared in Judaism before the 13th century, but the man who published it, you might say, Moses de Leon, of course this is hundreds of years before printing, the man who made available, who copied out copies, claimed that he was copying from an ancient manuscript. Now, it turns out most scholars in this field are in agreement that the book was written in the 13th century, that Moses de Leon himself wrote most of the Zohar. So why did he attribute it to the ancient Rabbi Shimon? Why did he come out and say that he was the author of the Zohar? Probably the main reason is so that his radical ideas would be accepted. For example, if Moses de Leon had come out and said, I have an idea, God is a woman, that might not have gone over so well. But now he was saying that the ancient Rabbi Shimon was teaching us about Shekhinah, the feminine half of God, and her romance with her divine partner, the Holy One, blessed be He. So because people believed that Zohar went back to this ancient Rabbi Shimon, The Zohar had its effect and its impact. It was that guise of ancient authority that was certainly the main factor in Moses de Leon's decision to write what's called pseudepigraphically, falsely attributing the book to this ancient figure, Rabbi Shimon, who lived 1100 years. Now, it may be that Moses de Leon actually believed that he was in communion with Rabbi Shimon, and that he was somehow channeled through the thoughts of Rabbi Shimon. In a down-to-earth explanation, we know this from a medieval source. It's really a third-hand story, so we can't necessarily accept it as true, but I think it may reflect something of Moses de Leon's motivation. You see, what happened was a Kabbalist from the land of Israel to Spain, a man who had grown up in Israel. He came to Moses de Leon and he said, "You claim that you're copying from a book that was written a millennium ago in the land of Israel. I come from the land of Israel. We've never heard of this book. Show me the original." Moses de Leon said, "Meet me at my home in a few months and I'll show you the original." But by the time the man came to Moses de Leon's home, Moses de Leon had died. So this priest, who was somewhat skeptical, came to his wife, said to his wife, "Look, your husband promised me that he would show me the original of the Zohar from which he copied." And his wife replied, "I can't show you any such manuscript because my husband quote what he did from his own mind. And when I saw him writing," his wife said, hand of account, "when I saw him writing without any material before him, I used to say to him, 'Why do you tell everybody you're copying a book when you have no book and you're writing from your own head? Wouldn't it be better for you to say that the work was your own creation? Then you'd get more credit.'" According to this report, her husband de Leon told her, back when he was still alive, quote, "If I told them my secret and that what I wrote was my own invention, they wouldn't listen to my words and they wouldn't pay anything for them because they'd say I made it all up. But now, written under the influence of the Holy Bar Yochai, pay a lot of money for them, as you can see. This story may be an invention.
No,
it's likely that financial considerations were also a factor in Moses de Leon's project. By attributing the work to the ancient Rabbi Shimon, Moses de Leon convinced many people to accept and respect the Zohar. Within a few decades, few people dared to challenge the authority of the ancient son of Yochai. Gradually became known as Zohar HaKadosh, Holy Zohar, often considered the third holiest book in all of Judaism, after the Bible and the Talmud. Some people claim, Kabbalists claim, that it's the holiest book. The Zohar is a commentary on the Torah, so it claims to show the deepest meaning, the mystical meaning of the Zohar. It's only in relatively recent times that Moses de Leon's actual role has become clear. He was far more than a scribe. He was the composer of the Zohar. He drew on earlier medieval material, and he may have collaborated with other Kabbalists in Spain. So here we have a book composed in the 13th century, yet ascribed to ancient sources. Maybe that's why the Zohar calls its teachings Chadatin Atik in Aramaic, which means new ancient words. These are brand new, but attributed to ancient sources. But in other senses, too, they're new and ancient, and we'll come to that soon. It's really that dialectical relationship with the past, simultaneously new and ancient, that makes Zohar so intriguing. It's firmly rooted in the Bible and the Midrash, but it thrives constant discovery. Here, interpretations in the Zohar introduced as follows. But come and see. This verse has already been established, but come and see. The Zohar celebrates creativity. Maybe Moses de Leon picked up some of his enthusiasm for that from another Kabbalist, a man named Jacob ben Sheshet. Mitzvah, it's a good deal for every wise person to innovate in Torah according to his capacity. In other words, it's a religious commandment to create new interpretations of Torah. That's really what is behind the Zohar's creativity. After one innovation, that Kabbalist, then Sheshet, says this. Once he brings a certain innovation, and then he says, don't think that this is far-fetched. If I hadn't invented it in my mind, I would say that it was transmitted to Moses. That's amazing. In other words, he's aware that he's created it, but he rings true with most ancient tradition. And that really shows us something about all of Kabbalah as it begins to emerge in the 13th century. As I've mentioned, most of the Zohar consists of a mystical commentary on the Torah, penetrates the literal meaning, what's called the Pshat, the simple sense verse, searching for something beneath the surface, something more profound. As the Zohar puts it, there's not a single word or letter in the Torah that contains sublime, precious secrets. The message seems to be, don't be content with the simple meaning of the Bible. Question the text. Question becomes a supreme value. The Zohar is commentary, but at the same time it's shaped a kind of mystical novel. Rabbi Shimon and his colleagues, that ancient Rabbi Shimon who lived 100 years earlier, he's the hero of the Zohar, and we hear about Rabbi Shimon and his colleagues wandering through the hills of Galilee, sharing secrets of Torah, running into strange characters on the road. For example, a donkey driver who seems to be like a total idiot, but of course turned to be a great sage in disguise. Or a little child who pokes at the rabbis, who enriches them with precious things. The Zohar is a medieval experiment in think of Dante and the Divine Comedy. Dante wrote the Divine Comedy about 10 years after the Zohar. Of course, in Italy, not that far from Spain. The Zohar likes also journeying through realms of heaven and hell. One of its themes is the mystery of the eternal feminine, as in Dante. Chaucer and the Canterbury. Chaucer wrote the Canterbury Tales about a century after the Zohar. And the Zohar is also describing the pilgrimage. Devotees of Torah journeying to discover Shekhinah, the divine presence. As in Chaucer, those travels are enriched by tales. Think finally of Don Quixote, written about 300 years after the Zohar in Spain. The rabbis of the Zohar are also engaged in a fantastic quest to vanquish evil. If Don Quixote is a knight errant, a wandering knight, the hero of the Zohar, Rabbi Shimon, is a saint errant, a holy man wandering in search of wisdom. But the plot of the Zohar focuses ultimately on the inner life of God. And here we come to this diagram, this chart. Take a look for a moment or two. I don't intend to go through this in any great detail because we'd be here till midnight. But a few highlights of this so that I can introduce you to a passage or two from the Zohar. These are seen as aspects, you might say, of God's personality. Now, how can you have God in the Jewish text? Heretical. What saves this from being heretical is that the ultimate reality of God is the white space. And then you could say extending off in all directions. Ad Ein Sof. So the ultimity cannot be depicted. What we see here is how Ein Sof expresses itself, how Ein Sof makes itself accessible to our limited human minds. Several of these Sfirot are identified with biblical heroes. Look, for example, a little bit down from the where it says in the circle, the literal meaning is love. That's divine love, which is balanced by its opposite, Gevurah, divine power, God's love toward the world, but God's power, or also known as din, God's judgment of the world. People would get away with murder. But if God just judged the world, then they'll be condemned to be destroyed every day. So God has to balance love and judgment, love and power, reflected in biblical characters. In other words, human biblical heroes represent the qualities. Who represents love? It says here Abraham. It's the last word on that list of terms and quality to the right of the Sfirah Chesed. It is love, also known as Gedulah, grace, white, the color white, water, because it's flowing, love, God's right arm, because this whole thing is seen as a human-shaped figure, a divine figure, but shaped in the form of, as it were, a human being. Remember, Ezekiel sees on the throne a figure with the appearance of a human being. So in a sense, the description of what Ezekiel saw, it's a divine and human figure simultaneously. With Abraham, why Abraham? You may remember stories about Abraham with the flaps of the tent open, eager to welcome in any strangers, So you could say Abraham lived out quality of chesed, of divine love. Abraham experienced in his actions that he attained the quality of chesed. What about Isaac? What was Isaac's primal religious experience? You would say. Akedah, being bound on the altar, almost being sacrificed by his father. Right? Abraham almost kills Isaac in fulfilling the divine command. So that God says, that's not what I want. But Isaac, people say Isaac's primal religious experience was almost being killed. So he encountered divine power, divine judgment, this left side of the divine, and he attained that quality. Abraham lived out chesed. Isaac experienced the raw, frightened power of the divine and judgment. Jacob blends the two of them. So Jacob attains this middle sfirah, this middle quality of Tiferet. So that's an example of how the Zohar reads the biblical stories as teaching us about the dynamics of God's life. But beyond all of these sefirot is the unity of the divine. As I said, the white space, that would be Ein Sof, there is no end. The goal of the whole system is to unite the male and the female. Male and female appear in various places in this chart, but primarily the middle Sefirah Tiferet is seen as masculine, and the last of the 10 Sefirot, Malchut, I'll refer to her as Shekhinah, or other name. Shekhinah means presence, Malchut means kingdom. So Malchut or Shekhinah is the feminine, Tiferet, masculine. The goal of the system is to unite the masculine and the feminine. Let's move to the top. Have I lost everyone? Yeah? Okay, good. So let's try something a little more difficult. Let's move to the top of the Sefirot. As I said, it transcends all of these. Now, what is the first Sefirah? The first Sefirah is called Keter, literally crown. It's a crown on the head. Remember, this is all with the right arm and left arm, masculine and feminine. If it's human, it's an androgynous human being. It's both male and female. But on the head of this figure is Keter, the crown. But its more intriguing name is, it's also called will, but its most intriguing name is Ayin, spelled Aleph, Yud, Nun. That word means what? Nothing. I don't mean that it doesn't mean anything. The word means nothing or nothingness. It's the same as that first word in Ein Sof. Ein Sof means there is not Sof, there is not end. Ayin is that first word turned into a noun, nothingness. And what does it mean to? This does not mean that God doesn't exist. Rather, it conveys the idea that God is no thing. God is, you could say God is the oneness that animates all things. No thingness. I find that idea expressed in Meister Eckhart, a great Christian mystic after the Zohar, calls God nihil, writing in Latin. Writing in German, he calls God nicht. Just writing in Spanish, calls God, what? Nada. Nada, Nishya, was you have in Jewish and Christian mysticism and in Eastern mysticism a way to speak of God as beyond all being. In other words, God is so real that our normal words for existence don't do justice to God. So rather than call God the ultimate being, the mystics prefer this paradoxical term, no thingness or nothingness. That's what ayin represents, the origin of all being, but beyond any notion that we might have of normal being. Out of that ocean of no thingness, out of that primordial pool of shaded energy, emerges a primordial point known as the next sphera, Chokhmah. So Chokhmah, meaning wisdom, divine wisdom is seen as a ray of light or a point of light emerging out of this pool of no thingness. That point then expands into a circle and becomes the third sphera. Okay, that's all we have to know for now. The pool of nothingness, out of which emerges a ray of light, a point of wisdom, and that point expands into a circle, also pictured as a womb. Because Chokhmah is seen as father, and Bina on the left as mother. Here you have the other masculine and feminine. Chokhmah and Bina are father and mother. Tiferet and Malchut are, you could say, son and daughter, or husband and wife. So I'm telling you this now because I want to read to you a passage in which the Zohar describes how that point of wisdom emerges out of Keter, out of ayin, and becomes the palace of Bina. What we need to know is that Chokhmah is called also strange. Why would Chokhmah be beginning? You should say Keter. The first sphera is beginning. Keter is so unknowable, you can't even say this is the beginning. You can't point to it. Hidden source. Chokhmah is given the name beginning. A verse in, this is not in your head already, based on a verse in Proverbs, Reshit Chokhmah, the beginning of wisdom, beginning with wisdom. Then we are given names of God, and Bina happens to be called by the divine name Elohim. Elohim is one of the names of God that appears in the Bible, and that name is assigned to Bina. This is how the Zohar interprets the opening words of Genesis. And for that, we can turn the page and look at the first quote. Those of you who can read Hebrew, it says Bereshit bara Elohim, which of course we always translate in the beginning. God created. But what's the actual order of the created? Elohim, God. Because it doesn't say Bereshit Elohim, in the beginning God created. The Hebrew actually says Bereshit, in the beginning, bara created, Elohim, God. Now, of course, in biblical Hebrew, you can have the subject after the verb. It's no problem. So certainly the verse really means in the beginning God created. But the Zohar says no, it's according to the exact order the words appear. In the beginning, it created God. That's how the Zohar interprets the opening line of Genesis. Not in the beginning God created, but in the beginning it created God. Now who is the unnamable? Ein Sof, this no thingness. It's really almost impossible to distinguish between ayin, no thingness, and Ein Sof. So in the beginning, that unnamable, ultimate dimension of God created Elohim. Elohim being what? Sphira? Bina. That third is known as Elohim. I think that's the Zohar's way of saying what we think of as God isn't the ultimate reality of God. Our notion of God doesn't justice to the infinite divinity. Okay, I've kind of given you the punchline, but I want to read to you now how the Zohar offers that interpretation. Let me ask you to just put the paper down. I'll ask you actually to close your eyes. You don't have to. If you're comfortable, do so, because I want you to listen to this poetry. Don't try to make sense of every. Just see how the Zohar is kind of trying to describe the indescribable. Because what the Zohar is describing now is how God's own being begins to unfold from the infinite source. And it'll end up interpretation in beginning, or actually the Hebrew letter be, or with. He's reading it with beginning by means of that of wisdom, the unnameable one created Elohim, the third sphere of being. Bereshit, in the beginning, at the head of potency of the king, he engraved engravings in luster on high. A spark of impenetrable darkness flashed within the concealed of the concealed, from the head of infinity. A cluster of vapor forming in formlessness, thrust in a ring. Not white, not black, not red, not green, no color at all. As a cord surveyed, it yielded radiant colors. Deep within the spark gushed a flow, spraying colors below, concealed within the concealed of the mystery of Ein Sof. It split and did not split its aura, was not known at all, until under the impact of splitting, a single concealed supernal point shone. Beyond that point, nothing is known, so it is called Reshit, beginning, first command of all. The enlightened will shine like the Zohar, the radiance of the sky, and those who lead many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. Zohar, radiance, concealed of concealed structure, which touch and did not palace, with glorious days, so benefiting worlds. Zohar, race, sowing seed for its glory, like the seed of fine purple silk, wrapping itself within, weaving itself a palace, benefiting all. Beginning, the unknown concealed one created the palace. This palace is Elohim, God. The secret is Bereshit, bara Elohim. With beginning, created God. It's crystal clear. This is really how the Zohar teaches, without coming out and saying, without even naming the Sefirot, just leaving you kind of swimming or drowning in a sea of imagery, but touching something deep inside and pointing toward precedes our normal notion of what God is and who God is. As I said, Ein Sof and Ayin are beyond gender, but I want to focus my remarks now on what I think is maybe the greatest contribution of the Zohar, which is its teaching on Shekhinah, the feminine presence of God, or the feminine half of God. This, in a sense, is revolutionary because so much of Western religion pictures God as male, In Judaism, Christianity, Islam, we all know that God is dominantly masculine, patriarchal, father, king, ruler, judge. What's new in the Zohar, the most radically new thing in the Zohar, is that God is equally male and female. And the term for the feminine is Shekhinah. So in that chart of the Sefirot, she's the last of the 10, but we can leave the chart aside for now. I want to study with you a few short passages that culminate in a paragraph from the Zohar. So on the page of the handout. Some terms in Kabbalah or in the Zohar never appear earlier in Jewish sources. For example, Ein Sof. To call God Ein Sof, you never find that in the Bible, you never find that in the Word. Shekhinah, however, appears very frequently in the Talmud. Never in the Bible. You never have the term Shekhinah in the Bible, but you do have the verb, the root shachan, meaning to dwell, where God says, "V'asuli mikdash," have them build me a sanctuary. V'shachanti b'tocham, I will dwell among them. So God's dwelling among the people of Israel is central already in the Torah. The rabbis call the term Shekhinah referring to things in the world. For example, the Midrash of course is a rabbinic interpretation of the written Bible, the Torah. The Midrash asks an interesting question about Moses at the burning bush. God appears to Moses in the burning bush, right? The bush is burning but not consumed. So the Midrash says, why did God appear to Moses in a bush? A little why some shrub? The Midrash says, in order to teach you, in makom ba'aretz hanu min hashchina. There's no place empty of Shekhinah. God appears in a lowly bush to show you that God is everywhere. That's a typical rabbinic Shekhinah. So Shekhinah is what? You could say omnipresent, God's immanence in the world. But not a world, more specifically, book number 3, I read the Hebrew, the Chol Makom Shekalu, wherever Israel went in exile, Shekhinah imahem. Okay, if Israel was down in Egypt, enslaved in Egypt, Shekhinah was there. If Israel was in Babylonia, in Babylon, Shekhinah was with them. So Shekhinah is the aspect of God that never abandons the Jewish people. So God's presence in the world, but also God's intimacy with Israel. Number 4, Ashrehem Tzadikim, happy are the righteous, for they cause Shekhinah to dwell on earth. It's very interesting. You could say Shekhinah is on earth, right? Shekhinah fills the earth. That was number 1. Shekhinah is God's immanence throughout the world. But a righteous person, you could say, actualizes the divine potential in the world. By acting in an ethical way, by living a holy life, we can make God real in the world. I think that's the point of this. Happy are the righteous, they cause Shekhinah a place to live on earth because they live a holy life, because they welcome God into their lives. And the final line before we get to the Zohar itself, number 5, this is from the Talmud. Rabbi Yosef, when Rabbi Yosef heard his mother's footsteps, he would say, I will arise before Shekhinah, who is approaching. But what does that suggest to you? What does it add to Shekhinah? We already know that Shekhinah is God's immanence in the world. Shekhinah is God's intimacy with the Jewish people. But there must be something feminine about Shekhinah. And some scholars say, in the Zohar, in the Kabbalah, Shekhinah is feminine. But in rabbinic sources, Shekhinah is not feminine. It's just God's presence in the world. But this quote proves that, at least for this one rabbi, his mother was an embodiment of the Shekhinah. So somehow, represented the Shekhinah. But I can attest to the truth of that statement. It's a very significant line because it really shows you radical relation. The feminine half of God, again in Kabbalah, what seem to be the most radical teachings somehow have their root in the Bible or in the Talmud. I'm not saying that there's nothing new or revolutionary about Kabbalah, but it takes hints in the earlier literature and then builds a whole mystical system out of those hints. Okay, we're now ready to look at a passage from the Zohar on the Shekhinah. As I said, the Zohar is a commentary on the Torah. The Zohar is not a systematic book of mysticism. It's not chapter 1 in Sof, chapter 2, the 10 qualities, the 10 Sefirot. Not at all. It just starts with Moses. Near the beginning of this, commenting on Genesis chapter 3, the story we all know by heart, the expulsion from the Garden of Eden. And in this verse, chapter 3, verse 24, it says, just glance at the Hebrew. Even if you don't know Hebrew, I want to show you something about the shape of the Hebrew letters. This verse says, Vayigaresh et ha'adam, which means he drove out Adam. But the Hebrew adds a little word. That middle word, letters, what are those 2 letters? Aleph and Taf. The word in Hebrew that begins with the first letter of the alphabet, its only other letter is the last letter of the alphabet, so it has the whole alphabet, you could say. And Aleph to Taf. And what does it mean? Nothing. So it spans the whole alphabet, but it means nothing. It's very strange. How can you have a word that means nothing? What is a particle? What do they call it a particle? Because they don't know what to call it a particle. But how does it function? The word basically is a marker for a direct object if it has the definite article. In Hebrew, you can't say I drank the water. You have to say I drank at the water. You can't say I threw the ball. You have to say I threw at the ball. It's as if, and before you say the object, you say Aleph to Taf. Everything could possibly follow, and then you name a specific thing that follows. I'm not claiming that's the origin of it, but it's intriguing to have a word that is untranslatable and yet encompasses the whole alphabet. And that kind of word is too good for a rabbi to pass up. Right? And we know in the Talmud already there were rabbis who loved to interpret the word et. They saw the word et in the verse, they said, this shows something more than the literal meaning of the verse. For example, it says in Deuteronomy, et Elohim tiraun. You should be in awe of God. But it doesn't say you should be in awe of God. It says you should be in awe of et God. What does that et add a few nights ago? What does the et add? Nobody remembers? At least a few of you were there. You're a rabbi. You should be in awe of not only God, the et shows you should also be in awe of your rabbi. Now the et doesn't mean rabbi, it's just that et is there, it's an extra word, it must be adding something to the verse. So Rabbi Akiva, for example, in the Talmud says et there means you should also be in awe of your rabbi. The principle in Hebrew is et l'rabot. Et adds something to the meaning of the verse. So that we know already in rabbinic literature, that et can add something. The Zohar, et becomes specifically a name of Shekhinah. Why is she et? You might say the first of those 10 sefirot, ayin, or keter, is symbolized by aleph. Right? It's the beginning, it's the very beginning. So it's the first letter of the alphabet. You might say the last sefirah, she's Taf. But no, she's aleph to Taf. Because each of the sefirot includes the preceding sefirot. So Shekhinah includes all the preceding sefirot. She is known as aleph to Taf. So et becomes a code name for Shekhinah. And now we have enough information to read this passage in the Zohar. Okay, what's in italics is from Genesis, and what's in Roman type is from the Zohar. He drove out et Adam. Rabbi Elazar said, we do not know who divorced whom. Why does it say divorce? Because the Hebrew word legaresh, to drive out, can also mean to divorce. And according to the Midrash, it's as if God and Adam were married. God and Adam were a married couple, as it were, but because Adam disobeyed the command not to eat from the fruit of the tree of knowledge, God divorced Adam. That interpretation appears already in a rabbinic text. The Zohar is playing on that. But the Zohar says what? We don't know who divorced whom. If the Blessed Holy One saying that. The Zohar is not going to say that. That's too shocking. Or say, or not. But it makes you come up with this radical alternative. Obviously, he wants you. He's really saying that. But this is typical of the Zohar. It doesn't come out and say what it wants to teach. It makes the reader come up with the inner meaning by herself, by himself. We don't know who divorced whom. Did God divorce Adam or not? I think he means by this, the whole verse is turned on its head. He drove out et. Notice how he's reading it. He's not reading it, he drove out et Adam. He's putting the period after et. Et, meaning he drove out Shekhinah. He divorced Shekhinah. Who divorced Shekhinah? Then you read the next word, Adam. Okay, this obviously turning the verse on its head. That's what he says. The word is transposed. The whole verse is turned on its head. He drove Shechina. He divorced Shechina. Who divorced Shechina? Then you read the next word, Adam. Adam actually drove out Et. Notice he hasn't told us that Et means Shechina. I had to tell you that. 50 pages later, we'll say Et happens to be a code name for Shekhinah. It's written in that cryptic way. It's like a mystery novel. Consequently written, Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh Elohim, this double name of God. Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh Elohim expelled him from the Garden of Eden. Okay, the Zohar does not deny that Adam expelled him. That God, Adam had already driven out the Shekhinah, as we have explained. Okay, I love that. As we have explained, he didn't really explain it. Second of all, when did he explain it at all? In one line earlier. But now it's a tradition, as we have explained. This is the style of the Zohar. So this sounds intriguing, but what does this mean? Adam divorced Shekhinah. It may mean that he should have united the male and female halves of God. He should have meditated on the union of Shekhinah and Sphira, the masculine Sphira, instead of uniting the two through meditation, through contemplation, or maybe fulfilling God's command. Instead of uniting the two, he split them apart. It might mean that he divorced Shekhinah from her partner. Maybe it means he divorced Shekhinah from himself. He had an intimate relationship with the divine, but now he lost contact with the divine because he failed to fulfill the first command. Or maybe it has a psychological meaning that Adam and Eve became aware that they were separate. Right? It says they ate from the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. They realized they were naked. So they realized something about their individual personalities. They became separate egos. They each became a separate individual. So then they were just somehow part of the stream of undifferentiated existence. Now they became aware of what us to each of us as we grow up. Right? Every baby, until a certain point, a baby, and then sometime in the second year, the baby starts to figure out that it's a separate individual. So Adam and Eve are going through that same individuation, that same discovery of separateness. Maybe in that sense, he became divorced from the Zohar doesn't explain what it means, but the main thing it's doing is turning the verse on its head. This is in a sense the counterpart to in the beginning God created. Right there, the Zohar took the subject God and made it into the object. In the beginning, it created God. Here's the object. He drove out Adam, and it makes the subject. Adam is really the one who drove out, who expelled. So the Zohar loves to turn the verses on its head. Now, the Zohar knows, the author of the Zohar knows that that's not the simple meaning of the verse. But he wants to convey some theological point. I said a few minutes ago, 15 minutes ago, that the Zohar calls its teachings new, ancient, right? That really applies very much to this idea of Shekhinah. I say that because, in one sense, the idea of God being half male and half female is brand new. Right? You don't find that in a Jewish text before the Kabbalah. No Jewish text that I'm familiar with says God is equally male and female until the Kabbalah. It's very hard to find feminine descriptions of God. You can find a phrase here, an image there in the book of Jeremiah, or half a line, or whatever is talked about the union of the male and female within God. So this is certainly a new idea. But on the other hand, what do I not to the Bible, but to what the Bible is fighting against? What are the prophets condemning the people for? Worshipping the false gods and goddesses of Canaan. So there is a goddess in the ancient Near East, just that the Bible is fighting against it. The Bible is trying to eliminate, to eradicate the whole idea of the goddess. And you might say, in some sense, what happens in the Zohar is the idea of the goddess somehow re-emerges now within Judaism. Right in the heart of medieval Judaism, you have that feminine, which had been rejected entirely by the biblical authors, now re-emerging. Gershom Scholem, the great scholar of Kabbalah, he calls this the revenge of myth. The goddess, but somehow picturing God as the human soul, the Jewish soul, and the humans, to picture God not just as the disciplinarian, not father, but as the loving mother, as the compassionate mother. So that idea of the feminine goddess somehow now resurfaces in the guise of Shekhinah. You really could say, to risk being a little, that Shekhinah is the goddess become kosher. The goddess has now become kosher under the name of Shekhinah. So in that sense, it's both new and ancient. Yeah, but it's recovering some ancient stratum. Some ancient layers could not be completely defeated. In fact, more remarkable than that is that we know that in ancient Israel, not only were there Israelites who worshiped the goddess, there were some Israelites who wanted to combine the worship of the goddess with the worship of the God of Israel. How do we know that? We know that archaeologists have found inscriptions. For example, there's an inscription just about 10 miles south of Jerusalem, which says, this is in honor of Yud-He-Vav-He, right, the God of Israel, and his Asherah, his Canaanite goddess named Asherah. So there were Israelites trying to combine the worship of the one true God with his wife, with his counterpart, Asherah. And in the Zohar, that becomes the union of the Holy One, blessed be He, and Shekhinah. I don't want to give you too much Zohar at once because I want you to fall with it. So let's just close with a parable from the Zohar, and then I'll be happy to take some questions. On the last sheet of the handout, last page. Parable that appears in the middle of the Zohar. It's about how to study the Bible, how to study Torah. About those living in the city. He sowed wheat and ate the kernels raw. One day he entered the city. He's a health food nut. He just wants pure wheat berries. That's enough for him. One day he entered the city. They offered him good bread. The man asked, "What is this for?" He replied, "To eat." He tasted very good. He asked, "What's it made of?" Oil. He tasted them and asked, "And what are these?" They answered, "Wheat." Later, the oil pastry needed honey in it. He asked, "What are these made of?" They answered, "Wheat." "Surely I am the master of all of them, since I eat the essence of all of these." Because of that view, he knew nothing of the delights of the world, which were lost to him. So it is with one principle, but is unaware of all those delectable delights, diverging from that principle. What's going on here with this mountain man? What's his? What strikes you about this? There's not one message here necessarily, not one correction, but let's start us off. Please. The what? The elephant and the blind man. Yeah. He knows one element, he knows a part of it, and he thinks that's all there is. So whatever they introduce him to, he reduces it to the one thing he knows. Now, the only difference is that with the elephant, each of those parts, the tusk and the legs and the tail, whatever, those are all parts of the elephant. There's not one part which is like the whole elephant. But here, he does have, there's no doubting that he does have what? He does have the essence. Everything to the essence. It's like the elephant, but just a little more so. That he reduces everything to the essence. He's trapped in the literal. If this is about Torah, he's a fundamentalist. This is really a 13th century attack on fundamentalism. Saying this guy knows, maybe he knows the Bible, appreciate how it could expand in meaning. Now, when they show him the bread, actually he likes it. He eats the bread. That's probably midrash. That's probably the literal sense being expanded by the rabbis into Talmud and midrash, and that he likes. He appreciates it. But then he asks this question: what's it made of? Then they give him the next layer. That's probably philosophy. Notice it doesn't say he ate. Rather, he tasted. Takes a taste. He asks his animal. Then they give him the ultimate delight, the baklava. Right? See, some things you lose in translation, but then there are new possibilities that rise. So the ultimate is probably Kabbalah. What happens this time? He doesn't even taste. Just asks this question. They say wheat. He says, I know wheat. So he doesn't need to even get to the ultimate. He feels. Please, so. Exactly. That's the source of the principle. Is the essence. You don't know how to apply it in life. It's very Jewish. Because usually mysticism, the goal is to get to the essence. Meditate on the meaning of life, apply it, to live it out in community. Not just the criticism of him. You could say this isn't only about how not to read, it's also about how not to teach. They're a total failure. They should say weed, and this is what you do to it. Weed, and this is what you add to it. So both of them are missing something. Yes. Yes. If it's about mysticism, then maybe it's also a critique of mysticism, of mystics who are so fixated on divine nothingness or the origin of it all, they forget, how to live in the world. It's also ascetic, right? Not Hasidic, but ascetic. We were talking about this before. Usually in mysticism, you try not to indulge in the, in fancy things or fattening food. But this guy, he's very noble. He just wants to have the most simple thing possible, but everything that could emerge in the world. Okay. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Right. 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 Uh-huh. It's really his poverty of imagination. You could say he has the essence, trying to apply it, or you could say he misses the essence. You could, right. I could also say he has the essence, but the point here is S. Yeah. Please. Yeah. Right. Getting us into more to Kabbalah, there are 4 levels of meaning. Okay, the literal is called pshat. Then the next one is remez, a hint, resh. Then drash or midrash, a dalit, and finally sod with a sards, pardes. They resh dalit samach. Pardes meaning a good orchard. That word then later becomes paradise in Greek. But in Hebrew means an orchard of Kabbalah. The whole riches of Kabbalah demand of Torah, demand that you be open to all these levels. Now it's interesting, you say Pardes, but the progression is really Pshat, and then what? Midrash, Drash. It should be PD, then comes Remez, hint, then philosophy, then comes so. So it should be PDRS, which spells what? Padres. That fits Spain better even than Pardes. But the acronym they use is Pardes. Please. It's what? Clarity? Clarity. And how does that relate to this, or relate to the separate? Yeah, but to see through the surface layer, not to be fooled by outer coating of reality or the outer layer of it's trying to penetrate more deeply to see through, so the text becomes transparent and something seen before. The definite progression of that's how Kabbalah reads the Torah. Yeah. And Zohar, meaning radiance. All the books are about light, about vision, about something shining through. Please. Yes, the words, right. Yeah. Definitely. Yeah, just further unfolding of all those potential meanings. That's your questions about Kabbalah. Maybe you could stand up. Seeing from that's certainly finally with the ultimate delight. He never touches it. He never tastes it. He just asks his question. Once they say we, he doesn't need it. He thinks. Now, I almost think that the Zohar inherited a parable where all you need is the essence, all you need is the weight. Maybe he has all that he needs. The Zohar turns it on its head. The Zohar says no. He really missed the whole boat. It's hard to know. Any questions just generally about Kabbalah or Zohar? Right. highlights the emergence of the feminine in describing God in 13th century Spain. Certainly, one element is probably you would have this in mind when asking the question, was Mary. Of Mary in the church. Okay, well, these are Jews writing it, but they're living in Christian Spain. This don't happen in a vacuum. So the author of the Zohar, in fact, Moses de Leon. Why is he called Moses de Leon? Because he came from Leon. This is in France, but Leon, northwestern Spain. As he was growing up, there was a huge church built in honor of Mary. Probably the first church, certainly the first church in his city. In the 13th century, the church officially recognized the divine status of Mary. We say the semi-divine status of Mary. Mary was worshipped by common Christians for hundreds of years earlier. The church itself never recognized that Mary was divine or part of her honor. You could say literally Moses de Leon grew up in the shadow of Mary. Now, is it any accident that in the Zohar, all of a sudden, the divine feminine, the Christians are worshiping the feminine, and the Jews are worshiping the feminine, and Dante is writing about the 10 years later? So that, I'm not saying that they have emerged without that. Shekhinah exists in the Talmud. And we already saw that in the Talmud, there was one rabbi who thought that his mother was the embodiment of Shekhinah. So we don't need Mary to make Shekhinah feminine. But I think the fact that Christians are fascinated by Mary, worshiping Mary, stimulated the Kabbalists to write as much as they did about Shekhinah. Politically, I mean, you don't have challenging patriarchy, right? In Christian Spain, the king is still the king. He was a great king at the time. The king at the time also stimulated Kabbalah because he was interested in all world wisdom. The king at the time was really a figure. Usually we think of Renaissance as Italy, 15th century, but there's a Renaissance in Spain in the 13th century. In Spain, the king was Alfonso the Wise, Alfonso X. He had a project to collect all of the world's wisdom. How did he do that? He hired Jews and Arabs to translate works of philosophy from Arabic into Latin, and from Arabic into Castilian, into Spanish. There was no Spanish literature at all until the 13th century, but hardly compositions. There was no extensive literature until Alfonso X created it by having Jews and Muslims translate works of wisdom and Greek philosophy from Arabic, right, which had originally been Greek to Arabic to Latin, Greek to Arabic to Castilian. The Jews were studying that, along with Muslims, and he's creating a whole library of the wisdom of the world. He interested in Kabbalah. And maybe Moses de Leon convinced him that the Zohar was ancient, that it really went back to the 2nd century, and that it was worth his while to also support him. We don't know that, but there was some connection between Moses de Leon and the crown and the Spanish royalty. So it's not that women are becoming empowered. I would say this: it took 700 years from saying God is feminine to saying women are equal. Okay, that took only 700 years. It took 700 years, but it was a great breakthrough to say in terms of the divine, because as you said, kings were empowered, male kings were empowered, because they claimed they were the model, they were modeled on the divine king. Here you have a divine queen. It takes, there are queens, human queens, but it takes a long time for women to be enfranchised. But this is part of feminism. In a sense, it's recovering I mentioned the exile of the Shekhinah, right? Wherever Israel goes into exile, Shekhinah is with them. You could also understand it as the exile of the feminine. The feminine was exiled. Okay, the goddess was eliminated, disenfranchised, or women were, turned into secondary humans, as it were. And that was an exile of the feminine. And then the emergence of the feminine is partly is partly aided by this theological transformation, insisting that God is male and female. Please. Just talking to the microphone? Have people talking to the microphone. Okay, well, it's a good idea. Why don't you, or just speak loudly if you would. You could stand up, because some people can't hear you. Is Shekhinah feminine? I'll repeat the question. Is Shekhinah of feminine word? Shekhinah as a noun is feminine. Right, so that's important. Right, because every noun in Hebrew is either masculine or feminine. So the fact that the rabbis use them to start. But the thing is that it's very description in the Talmud, in the Midrash, of Shekhinah's feminine. But Rabbi Yosef, identifying his mother as an embodiment of Shekhinah, it's very hard to see. But did you hear about Shekhinah hovering or Shekhinah protecting? So there's something motherly about that. Maybe one more questions, and then I'll be happy to continue individually with people. Yeah, I don't want to get too technical. We can talk more about that later. But in one sentence, Sefer Yetzirah is an early, you might say, proto-Kabbalistic, pre-Kabbalistic text, probably written around the 2nd century. So this is the time of Rabbi Shimon. This is 1,000 years before Kabbalah emerges, the book of formation or the book of creation. Tikkun Zohar we can talk about after. Yes. Right. Study of Zohar deepened my understanding of Torah. No, I'd say it makes me look. It makes me question the text. Sometimes the Zohar's questions are better than its answers. But there are wonderful things the Zohar says, but it's especially boldness of its interpretation that I find, particularly exciting. Last question, please. Different versions of Kabbalah, right? Is there one authentic Kabbalah? I would say that there is no such thing as the authentic Kabbalah. Kabbalah just keeps emerging and growing. I'm particularly interested in the Zohar itself and not what great 16th Zohar is 13th century, Isaac Luria Witchery and Safed and Sfat, and he does his own thing with it. But my interest is really what the Zohar says itself. It's such beautiful poetry, it's such beautiful imagery. I don't really want to fit in that Lurianic box. All of Kabbalah eventually became Lurianic Kabbalah because he was so dominant. My preference to go back to what a teacher of mine called Shat HaZohar, the simple sense of the Zohar. Why don't we stop there? I'll be happy to sign some books. Thank you. Goodbye.
It is my honor and privilege to open this wonderful evening with such an honored guest and dear friend as Danny Matt. We're celebrating tonight the end of Danny's great translation project of the Zohar into English. I brought with me 3 volumes, but you need to imagine from this table. It's a private celebration, and I can not even a celebration to those like me who dedicate their lives to studying this phenomenal book. Great celebration. Celebration for all to come. For Danny Matt's great project will persist long after we will be gone. 18 years ago, a group of scholars was invited to the US to discuss together the possibility of translating the thousands of passages of the Zohar into English. Some said this is an improject. No one, they said, would be able to translate the obscure Aramaic language of the Zohar and turn it into a readable English. Now, 18 years after, we are here in Jerusalem celebrating the completion of this grand endeavor. The Pritzker edition of Danimat, with contribution by Joel Hecker and Nathan Wolski, will make the Zohar the most accessible it has ever been. This event calls for a siyum, a ritual traditionally said when one completed the study of Masechet, tractate in the Talmud. This custom first known by Abayeg, the head of the yeshiva in Babylon, who would make a big feast like the one just mentioned. For anyone in his yeshiva completed the chapter of study, people on many occasions. I feel that 18 years of poring over old manuscripts, finding a fitting translation, or writing it coded in dense passages and words of the Zohar, sitting in his home overlooking the Berkeley Hills, day after day, year in, year out, deserve this kind of festival. Please join me in this ritual, reciting the Hadran Allah, meaning we should return. Or as our dear colleague Shlomo Naed taught me, it really means your splendor, Hadar, will be on us. This is traditional text with small changes made for this occasion. Some translations in light I want to call Danny. I would like you to rise if it's possible for the Hadran Allah. Hadran Allah ספר הזוהר והדרן עלה. דעתן הלך ספר הזוהר ודעתן עלה. לא ניתנה שימינך ספר הזוהר ולא תתנה שימינם לא בעלמא הדין ולא בעלמא דעתו. We will return to you, O Zohar, and you will return to us. Our splendor upon you, O Zohar, and your splendor upon us. The mind is on you, O Zohar, and your mind is on us. We will not forget you, O Zohar, at us, neither in this world nor in the world that is.
That's just bullshit. They just blabbing. I don't even know.